Our next respondent is Aishwary Kumar, and for 20 minutes, calmly and quietly, and then we will open it for the next series.
Is this 20 minutes per speaker or per?
For you.
I want so quickly. I mean, these are two phenomenally rich papers. It was a pleasure and an honor to read your papers, Professor Pernau and Professor Hanretta. I was going to begin by speaking a little about the play of negative universal history in these papers, both these papers, but I think we've touched upon some of that. I was especially thinking of Adorno's Hegel lectures, where really he puts it quite well when he says the task of negative universal history is to both construct and deny it. That is to say, construct and deny universal history. And this is remarkably relevant to some of the things that are happening in these two papers. I'll come to them quickly, one by one. But continuing from the first panel, the question of the relationship between critique and crisis, which is central to Margaret's paper on Sayid Ahmad Khan. Now, what is this paper really doing? Now, nothing shadows North India, colonial or otherwise. Its factional strife, its literary resplendence, its poetic melancholy, its biting humor, its social criticism, its political theory, more decisively than the mutiny. In fact, I think, I believe that the mutiny has had a more enduring impact than even the partition of the subcontinent on what we call today the figure of the minority. And the moving minority, of course, is the title of Shawn's paper, and I'll try and connect the two dots here. But if that were the case, if really the mutiny is central in some way, as something more than the event itself, no figure is more important to this intellectual or conceptual history, or the conceptual history of this period, than Sayid Ahmad Khan. And that is the main protagonist, the main author and thinker at the heart of Margaret's fascinating paper. These two papers are also very unique in the ground they cover. They're very well cited. They're very highly, they're in depth, and they're very highly aware of the literary and the material traditions that they traverse themselves. But what I really, to begin with Margaret's paper, what I thought was the highlight is the granular reading of this event through a figure. In fact, I would rather read it counterintuitively, because the paper offers a reading through Sayid Ahmad Khan of this very complex, multifaceted event that we call the Indian Mutiny. At the heart of this paper is another counterintuitive relation, and I'm taking liberties with the text here because this is not exactly what Margaret frames it as. But I think at the heart is the relationship between tehzeeb, which is often translated as civility, or civility, as Margaret argues, comes to be translated as or appropriated in the language of tehzeeb, and bagawat, which is revolt. And the powerful dimension of this relationship is that in the North Indian Muslim past, and this is what Sayid Ahmad Khan grapples with, and which this paper brings out, is how to think of civility and rebellion, or civility and mutiny, or tehzeeb and bagawat in a productive tension rather than as conceptual antithesis. how can we understand, in other words, the violence of the mutiny within the larger history of colonial adab or colonial tehzeeb? And that is where I think Sayid Ahmad Khan becomes one of the most important post-mutiny thinkers of North India. And when I say thinkers, I actually do think that he's not simply a colonial Muslim thinker. Although conventional historiography has pitched it like that, because conventional historiography remains highly conservative in its absolute nationalism. It's uncompromising, and the very idea of a minor tradition is endemic to all nationalist and mainstream tradition. And I think what Margaret's paper invites us to do is to think of a constellation of intellectual traditions of which Sayid Ahmad Khan can become, or at least I read the paper to be doing that, as central, as a central figure in this negotiation between the past and the future. Now, the past and the future, Koselleck is in the air, we've done that panel, so I won't press on that point. But what is truly original here in Margaret's analysis is how she grasps or tries to apprehend Sayid Ahmad Khan as a reader and a thinker of the new, not the modern in terms of progress, but jadid, that which is new. And what it allows him to do is that it allows a simultaneous relation to be forged between the past, the Muslim past, the Delhi past, a city that he made his own, was intensely emotional about, and connects it to the Muslim futures of not just the subcontinent, but broader history as such. What is the new? And that's the question that I will perhaps try to keep in the background as we go forward. What is jadid? Margaret calls this a work of, or a work with a series of semantic sets. That's the expression I think she uses, to understand two things: notions of the temporal and notions of what I call moral psychological, you call emotional, analytic philosophers simply call practical reason. There is a good deal of that element of pragmatism inscribed at the very heart of Islamic tradition in Shawn's paper. I'll come to that in a moment. But there are two levels at which, as we know, Margaret's paper is titled Emotions and Temporalities. And there are these two levels that she does a fine, at times brilliant work of layering together. Notions of the temporal move through certain concepts that, in my view, we should not feel the urgency to, or the drive to, or be compelled to actually translate. Part of conceptual history also borders on that which is, or which must remain untranslatable. Margaret begins by speaking of Sayid Ahmad Khan's book on Delhi, which is poetic and literary, and offers an affective topography, in a sense, of Delhi, the bylanes, the measurements, the streets, and so on. And he calls it Asar ul Sandid, 1847. Now, Asar is interesting because it's not force, it's not impact, it's something less than that. It's subtle. It's a signature. You translate it as sign of something. There is the word silsila that comes into play, which is more chronological, sequential. There is asbab, which he uses in the book on mutiny, which is the most historicist Sayid Ahmad Khan we see in a conventional sense, which is about the causality, all the sets of causes through which we understand historical events. And then there is, of course, the question that ruptures everything, which is the word inqilab, or revolution. or that which is revolutionary. Now, through these four key concepts of North Indian Urdu and Hindustani and so on, words that are part of ordinary language, Margaret gives us an insight into the different layers of the temporal through which Sayid Ahmad Khan works in his writings. And this is one of those papers, and of course Margaret is very generous, and she does say that Lelyval's Aligarh's first generation remains an unsurpassed account of that school, and the institutional context is very important here. So is the colonial context. Much of it happens within a theater of state patronage, emerging languages of rights, struggles for franchise eventually, and so on. So the establishment of the Anglo-Muhammadan, Anglo-Oriental Muhammadan College, the Muhammadan Literary Society, those are the institutional events around which this one thinker is negotiating a series of, shall we say, traps of modernity. And he's trying to craft nothing short of a language, and I would even say nothing short, following Margaret, of a moral psychology that is proper to what we would eventually call a minority discourse in South Asia. What is the power of Sayid Ahmad Khan as it comes through in this paper is that we miss the richness and the granular intensity of the thinker when we approach it, or when we approach this corpus of writings that you do a reading of through the prism merely of a minority discourse, or what the historian Faisal Devji calls merely apologetic modernity. There's something more to this modernity. There is, in fact, there is no modernity at all. There is the new. There's a striving to grasp the new in a way that does not, or that refuses to translate tarakki simply as progress. There's a fascinating passage in the paper where Margaret delves with the various meanings of tarakki, and one of the scandalously underknown or underappreciated aspects of that word is that it's not linear, it's topographical. Sometimes it just means height. Sometimes it simply means majesty. Sometimes tarakki is related more proximate to the figure of the sovereign God than to human progress itself. And I think that amphibiousness of tarakki is something that must mark all our attempts to understand what is truly modern about Muslim South Asia, but generally about Islamic past. That tarakki is not exactly translatable as progress. Where does that actually leave then the question of the minority? And this is where I thought the intimacy or the proximity between the two papers are the strongest. I would love to read Shawn's quote towards the end of his paper, where he says, material goods, and this is about circulation. This is about the materiality of religious fact. Material goods reduce poorly to figures of discourse. They have contradictory meanings, and with their ability to move between people and so on, all these properties make them undisciplined companions to human activity. And yet Shawn does, I think, rigorously undo the binary between material facts of religious practice and its metaphysical assumptions. Part of this paper that I found the most interesting is how powerfully he problematizes some of the doxa of religious studies. He does it very subtly, of course. There's only half a sentence on Talal Asad. which is fair enough. And we've often talked about some of those paradigms in which modern religion or genealogy of religion, especially Islam, has been come to understood. Shawn dislocates some of those key discursive drivers. It's not simply an exercise of material history of religion. It's not simply a history of circulating goods, as Shawn, I think, with great epistemic humility calls it in the subtitle of his paper. I think what he's really offering is a scrupulous understanding of the relation between material practices and conceptual history. That, I think, is, or rather, the relation of concepts to everyday and ordinary language. He works a lot with translation, and on the fringes of that, which remain words that remain untranslatable. I've spoken about that, so I'll not go there. But the most fundamental dislocation here is to understand or renew our engagement with what is African and what is Islamic, and what is the relationship between these two very almost hermetically sealed categories, and yet in a dialectical play, whether it's histories of Maghreb, Mashriq. Shawn gives us a remarkable sweep of that historical tradition. I have to say these are two scholars that almost shock you with their humility. There are big points made with a remarkably understated elegance, which I really found a pleasure to read and an honor. What is happening in Shawn's paper is an attempt to understand the very genre of religious life, genres of religious speech acts, of how and when people come to forge a new relationship with theological language, and in so doing displace what we construe or understand theology to be doing in its normative sense. The great section there on graves, one would think that death has nothing to do with the politics of life, or some would say it has everything to do with the politics of life. Shawn gives us something in something hybrid, and he calls it mortuary politicization. What are graves, and why are they so central to understanding religious experience? Why are the dead so alive and so living in religion? I don't want to rear the political theory head in me, but you know, Thomas Jefferson was famous for once remarking that our originalist gluing to the Constitution as if there is some pure Constitution tells us of a farce, that we have come to believe that the earth belongs to the dead and not the living. Shawn almost reverses that Jeffersonian moment, as it were, and gives us a very productive, non-negative necropolitics, shall we say, for the lack of a better word, although that's a loaded, problematic term. But there are struggles about grave sites, which includes something that is often not written by, I will go out and say, not written with such attentiveness by male scholars of religion, which is grave sites as sites for gender roles, in the ways grave sites are accessed by or accessible to women. And it relates to a whole sequence of property rights, to conceptions of selfhood, as Margaret writes as well in her paper, the notion of the porous self. I'll come to that sentence in my closing couple of minutes. But this is what I think Shawn has asked us to do. To understand religion neither simply as a set of pragmatic instrumental tools that is wholly modern in this relationship to state and power, and nor as simply metaphysical laws, or even sometimes the jurisprudential heritage, but as something that takes into account the movement of bodies across frontiers, across borders. And perhaps most importantly, as I read his paper, understand religion as inseparable, or religious history as inseparable from histories of A, ethnicity, and B, migration. You cannot understand how Muslims become Muslims without understanding what their relationship to certain laws of movement and certain laws of quarantine, certain laws of labor mobilization, and even going to war is. And through that leap, Shawn uses this word, I think, only twice in his paper. But I think that's the most important and signal element here, which is religion to be understood, therefore, neither in terms of the language of sacrifice alone, which there is, of course, including sacrificial killing, war-bound activity, nor as mere effects of state power, but actually something that is connected to our very conception of authority. Neither as power nor as violence. These are, again, my political, theoretical ruminations, but I think Shawn gives us a subtle entry into how to understand religious authority in societies marked by fluid bodily movement. Not settled societies, but settler societies. Not agrarian societies, but tribal societies. And that, to me, hits very close to the ways in which religious history, at least within the context of empires and settler colonial empire, are not generally done. That emphasis on movement is remarkable. So I'll end with there, without emphasizing the disjuncture between the papers or their affinities. I think the latter is more strongly the case. I would ask Margaret to reflect on one expression which is related to history and crisis, is the notion of conservative temporality. Page 6, you write about Sayid Ahmad Khan's work on Delhi, and you speak of how the temporality at work in some of these texts remain conservative. What would conservative temporality be? Because to understand or to work with a notion of time and the temporal is already revolutionary. The very category is a category that dislocates that which exists. In fact, the massive investment, we think of J.G. Pocock's Machiavellian Moment, Koselleck's early work on Critique and Crisis, the notion of time is always revolutionary time. So the challenge here, which Margaret poses, is to think of temporality as sometimes that which conserves something. What is it that this regime of temporality seeks to conserve? And finally, just one question to Shawn, as to how closely your rich, again, equally granular history of whether Tunisian or Islam in Ghana and so on, can actually also be read as, and whether we get something more by pushing your arguments towards what, in at least one tradition of history writing, is called philosophical history. Not conceptual history, because you undo a lot of those neatly packed categories. But actually as philosophical history, as concepts with everyday life, without which religion remains, I think, inadequately politicized. How do we bring back politics And religion in its modern form has been, as you argue, as Margaret argues, has been centrally concerned with the political. How does this history give us an access to that political, for good or worse? That's an open question. But the political remains a very crucial dimension of this relationship between religion and time. Some say mystical traditions have a different understanding of time and so on, but I think your paper looks at lived religion and its relationship to not just time. The connection here that sutures these two papers, I think, is that they both offer us a topography of religion, not simply temporal, but hemispherical sometimes, spatial. So I'll leave there. And please.
Thank you, Professor Kumar. Yeah, if you want to. I called Shawn Hanretta for our first one. 10 minutes.
I'll just sit here if that's okay.
Yeah.
Thank you, Aishwary, for that very generous reading. Granular and humble, I suspect, are concepts that cut in a couple of different directions.
Yeah, they were meant to.
No, I mean, thanks so much for that. And let me work up to your question by saying that part of what I was trying to do in this piece is, I mean, I have a long-standing interest in reflecting on the relationship between particular kinds of narrative structures and the kinds of, sort of holographic senses of agency that they generate. And I was explicitly wanting to break with the modes of historicity in my sources, both the written sources and the oral sources, as ways of disrupting what I thought were the particular forms of agency that they were instantiating. And the strategy then was to center not on the body, for instance, not on the social power of the states, not on the discourses of Tajdid and Islah, which are very active in the discourse of these intellectual leaders, but on what, borrowing from David Schoenbrunn, I'm talking about in terms of bundles. Bundles which are connections between words, goods, and human activity. And I like bundle better than assemblage, I think. I can talk about that if you want. But and looking at what kinds of narratives then emerge from having those bundles be the kind of holographic agents that get dramatized. And I think part of the consequence of granularity and humility is that I was not actually trying to center on questions of authority. So that was obviously a failure on that part. I mean, because I think centering questions of authority does put us back in that Assadian trap. And instead thinking about the ways in which these bundles of terms, practices, goods, allow us to create a map between what we can tell about religious experience and these broader social historical processes, particularly loss of access to space, to land, specific kinds of land, the ways in which the state's construction of the community as a minority generates very specific forms of authority, but then in which those forms of authority do not actually, I think, have the main causal force within the broader stories. And so thinking about your question about how to imagine philosophical history in this context, and linking it up to questions about the politics of religious experience in the everyday. I think what I do particularly like about the concept of the bundle, and for Schoenbrunn, this is primarily, bundles are always durable. And I think their durability provides a nice index, for temporality in a way that, immediately then highlights the moments in which they break down, or if not break down, fray and disaggregate. And in part, of course, what's nice about the bundle is that it's well suited to the kinds of sources that Africanists are often working with, right? So historical linguistic sources, repurposed ethnographic sources, oral sources, as well as then these textual narratives. But even more, it provides a way of attending to things like intimacy, right? The body's moments of interactions with other goods, right? The body's relationship to the mortar, the mortar's relationship to food, to the ways in which both tears and the voice can be modes of interaction between living bodies and dead bodies. So that, again, I mean, I'm not thinking about a kind of new materialism. The idea isn't to make the things the agents, right? But rather to think about the ways in which the thing, the act, the word are all bundled together as the kind of holographic agents in that sort of way. So whether that maps onto that kind of philosophical history, I would be I would set it, maybe I would let others decide. But I do think one of the questions that I'm still struggling with in terms of the way of thinking through the consequences of the temporality that the bundle generates is that it's also refracting things like the history of migration, the history of land alienation, the history of the colonial state, the history of decolonization in different kinds of ways. And to what extent, do those make intelligible contributions to existing stories about those sorts of things in ways that are productively disruptive, and to what extent are they simply just operating someplace off to the side? So, yeah, that's about all I would say. Thank you.
This is amazing panel. They listen. Margrit Pernau next.
Thank you so much for this really careful reading, and also for the way that you brought the two papers in conversation to each other. Because when I read Shawn's paper, I really got jealous, because I thought this is the kind of paper I would have loved to write, and especially for this bringing together of the history of concepts and materialities. So I wanted to bring in something on Sayid Ahmed Khan and material practices, and I simply could not get there, because for Sayid Ahmed Khan, the only material practice he has is collecting funds for Aligarh in the second half of his life. So you get all these concepts about progress, about decline, about emotions, about, you just name it, and you have these really emotional articles in Tehzib ul Akhlaq, and then you say, well, now there must be a transformation of the life of everyone, and it's built up towards this transformation, and then he ends, now you donate. So it is really a bit poor on that aspect. So if any of you have suggestions how to bring in more materiality into that, I would love that. Where I'm really in two minds is your suggestion to read him as someone who brings together the past and the present and the future beyond the Muslim community. Because that is something that I've always, it's the way I have been trained to do. So working with people like Imtiaz Ahmed and Mushir al-Hassan and so on, it was always, let's go beyond these divisions between the Hindus and the Muslims, and in the end they live together, so they must have common concepts, and we have to bring that together, and the languages are not so far apart, so let me work at bringing them together. I really hate to say that, but I am not succeeding in doing that. So I would love to work with someone who has done the similar kind of work for Hindi. I've had discussions on that with Mohinder Singh, who has written an article on Unnati, so that would be Taraqi in Hindi, and by all the kind of assumptions that I would love to use, Taraqi and Unnati should work in a very similar way. But then Unnati you can translate as progress, and it is a category of movement, and Taraqi is not. So what do we do with that? I would love them to work in the same way, saying, let's forget about the divisions between Hindi and Urdu, and let's bring them together. It would be wonderful if that would work, but I'm no longer really convinced that this would work. So before I would buy into that, reading him as someone who is read beyond the Muslim community and who has an influence also on the conceptual history of Hindi and perhaps even Bengali. I think I would need to read these conceptual histories of the corresponding terms in Hindi and in Bengali. So just assuming that because he was so important and he is such a towering figure that these connections have to be there because we want them to be there and because we expect they should be there, perhaps is not quite enough. So, and I think especially for the history of concepts, you really need to do this kind of groundwork and looking at the words and looking at the words in their context and to see what is being done with that. So if someone would do that, and if someone would prove the skeptical me wrong, I would love it. So I long for being proven wrong. Another point where I'm not completely sure that I agree with you is this linking of Sayid Ahmed Khan to 1857. I think it's the other very general assumption that we have in all of the works, especially the most recent one on the bicentenary. So it is the one thing, he was influenced by 1857. The second thing is he's a modernist. If we look at the way that the chronology of his changes in concepts work. We have one which is situated around, let's say, between the 1840s and the mid of the 50s. So that is when the past really becomes the past and is no longer linked to the present as a kind of fuzzy boundaries between the past and the present. But that definitely happens by the time he has the second edition of the Asar Sanadid. That has taken place. So it is not due to 1857. And the other one is where we suppose that the impact of 1857 should be so strong is in the in the Asbab al-Baghavat. And there again, you look at the kind of political theory he is exposing, and that is a form of political theory which is very much pre-1857. And so if I were to divide him into phases of his life, I would have one phase which goes to the 40s. Then I would have one phase which goes from the 40s to 1870, where he has these fluid categories, where he is experimenting with what colonial modernity means, what colonialism means, and where he is also very open at that time to exploring the meaning of science. And then after 1870s and after his trip to London, that completely disappears. Aligarh is no longer interested in scientific progress. They're interested in moral categories. They're interested in training people who work the colonial state. So the whole thing of excitement that you have from the 40s to the 70s, which would be a period which is bridging 1857, then once Aligarh is there, again becomes something different. Not necessarily conservative, but it becomes something different from what it was before. And that brings me to the last point, the question of conservative temporality, whether time is always revolutionary time. I think it might be interesting in that it works for, let's say, a post-Enlightenment European conception of time, where on the one hand, time is about change, and where on the other hand, the past and the present are clearly divided from each other. So once you have a category of the past, which is definitely not the same as the present, and then you look at then you take time as a category to investigate what is changing between the past and the present. Then, of course, time has to be revolutionary. But that is exactly not the way that he conceptualizes it before the second edition of the Asar. So as long as he has, and I found the same concept of temporality also in Dana's paper. So it is relating to the past in a way where the past and the present bleed into each other, and there you can have a temporality, because the temporality is about how do the past and the present connect to each other, but it is not revolutionary, and it's not in the first instance focused about change, because in order for things to change, you have to divide them neatly beforehand. So that would be my
Thank you. Very interesting work on Sir Sayid Ahmad Khan, but also Islam in Africa, which is something I work on, but I also started my earlier anthropology work studying Indian Muslims in West Bengal. So as the idea of minority, what constitutes that? So I open it up for questions. You have a question?
For her, can I do that?
Okay,
Is that allowed? No, I just wanted to ask you about the relationship between Islah, Jadid, and Tajdid that you raise. And certainly in West Africa over the last 150 years, we see a kind of disappearance of the temporality of Tajdid, and which you nicely sort of show as kind of a way of linking past and present that's mostly cyclical, and its replacement with Islah in this way that's linking past and present in a way that's more progressive. And I was wondering, I mean, in terms of your noting that he uses Jadid but does not use Tajdid.
Yeah.
Whether that's reflecting a similar kinds of shift to the one that you were just describing in terms of accepting this kind of break between the present and the past in a more radical way. That there's the Jadid, but there's not the Mujaddid and the Tajdid.
I think there might be a very simple reason for that both Islah and Tajdid would occur in a religious framework, and that is where he's trying to keep his distance. So then Taraki would be the replacement for both of them.
For both.
Yes. Shall we collect a number of them? Okay, please.
I think I have a lot of questions. Oh, sorry. Did you actually?
Absolutely.
Sorry. I had a lot of questions for obvious reasons for Margaret, which I will have a discussion on the side. But I'm wondering where does this topography come from? Is there Ibn Khaldun in it? Is there? You mean there must be some heritage behind it that it's And is this a history or a topography? So I'm just wondering about the genre, and for obvious reasons.
Yes, and then pass it on.
I would like to ask Margaret about the changing meanings of words. Number one, what are the cultural origins of Sayid Ahmad Khan's terminology? And it's also obvious that, you know, he's creating new words or he's giving new meanings to old words. So he's very similar to other people in other parts of the Islamic world, like Central Asia or the Ottoman Empire, in which, you know, the idea of tarakki or inqilab becomes something new, or even the idea of jadid, right? There's this entire cultural movement called jadidism among the Russian Muslims. So, and in what regard this transition from something that's perceived as more traditional into something that's more modern, or in the midst of this crisis, you know, how does he invent this new language? How does he utilize it? How does he mobilize it? You know, these new concepts of time. So in that regard, even the idea of tarikh must become something completely different in the context of someone like Sayid Ahmad Khan, right?
Yeah, my first question is to Shawn, and I really appreciate your emphasis on movement, what also Aishwary brought out in his response, and I see it as I understand it, as a critique that you start with in the beginning of your paper, and you also mentioned that of Assad and his what you call this emphasis on orthodoxy and this question of correct and incorrect practices. And also you even spoke of an Assadian trap, and I would like to elaborate. Would ask you to elaborate maybe a bit on that, because I mean you seem to take up Shahab Ahmed's reading of Assad as focusing on this question of orthodoxy, but what I also see in Assad is this question of the state, the modern secular state, after his article on Islam as a discursive tradition. And so the category of traditional religion that you speak about is precisely an element of this modern secularizing discourse. And it is instituted by the modern, also powered by the modern state, not alone. So my question is, in how far, why do you need this critique of Assad here to make your point about movement, which I really appreciate. But I don't see it how it criticizes this focus or the Assad's emphasis on the importance of our location and the modern state and its powers on all levels, and define who is Muslim, what is Islam. And you talk about this, that these instances in the colonial state, there were moments that then seemed to call for defining who is Muslim and who is not. And there, the power of the state until now to define reality and present in relation to past and futures is, I think, essential. And that is, for me, what is Assad's work is really much about, and it connects to what you would say, because the state also regulates movements of people and goods. So, and the second thing is about material practice. Like maybe in a more general sense, when you separate, when you say collecting money or moving bodies are material practices, as opposed to, I guess, reading or writing or speaking, I would challenge this distinction or this conceptual architecture, because I think speaking is also a material practice. Right now, the words coming out of my mouth, like this is all material. So how, because I think this distinction, I'm not sure in how far it reproduces a distinction between what is real, the material, and then the ideas, the ideational. So for my thinking about conceptual history and the way how conceptualizing functions authorized by state practices, this is also something material. So maybe this is more a general methodological.
Thank you. You want to answer these three? And then
Okay, I'll try to be quick. Yes, so I would disagree. I mean, I do largely agree with Shahab Ahmed's critique of Assad, but I also am quite critical of his ideas about secularization and the state. And one of the things that I want to do is also argue that, in fact, the power of the state is usually vastly overstated. that the way that the state is constructing these categories has an effect, right, in that it produces a set of discursive tools that people can pick up. So part of what feeds into the sort of Jahiliyyah discourse is the way in which the state creates something like African traditional religion, which provides a set of temporalities that one can then imagine, right, Islamization playing out on top of a pre-existing set of culturally described and then often sort of ethnically described traditional practices, right? So it's useful, it's important insofar as it generates tropes that end up in those kinds of discourses. But my desire is to decenter those discourses entirely, right? The ones that the state is producing, the ones that Muslim intellectuals are producing, and the ways that they're both drawing together on these kinds of tropes that get generated by state power, not just the colonial state, but the Sokoto Caliphate and other kinds of states, other kinds of empires, right? I mean, we have competing empires. The Sokoto Empire and the British Empire are sort of generating their own sets of discourses about Muslim otherness and about cultural practices and ethnicities that are sort of being woven together. And I think one of the ways that that Assadian trap keeps coming back is it does keep centering those kinds of discourses in ways that I find very unhelpful for understanding what movement actually means to people. Because while the state is creating certain kinds of conditions around movement, it's not actually regulating movement and the circulation of goods. Movement is being generated by things like, you know, African entrepreneurialism and cash cropping, which is happening actually in spite of the efforts of the colonial state to control it. And the circulation of goods is happening in this context largely through the elongation of family structures and community structures in response to those kinds of labor migrations. And the state does indeed sanction certain kinds of land tenure practices that make it difficult for Muslims to have access to burial land, or to own and control burial land. But those practices that it's sanctioning are ones that are established by the Asante Empire before the British get there. And on the second point, again, I completely agree, right, about speech and writing as material practices. And so my desire is not to create an opposition between the material and the immaterial, but rather to create an opposition between modes of reading that attend to discourses and narratives, and modes of reading that attend to the place of the good in particular, right? Goods, maybe more than materialism, in, that's why I don't like the sort of new materialist approaches, within the sources, right? So that, you know, speech is interesting for me both in terms of the writing practices, but also, you know, for me to understand these writing practices, I also am interested in the instructions about how the text is supposed to be used and where the body is supposed to be positioned when a particular text or passage is recited, as well as the lisan al-hal and the kind of the materiality of speech and the way that that interacts with the body. So I would completely agree with that I don't want to produce that binary. It's rather sort of a way of reading that is supposed to kind of distance one from accepting the discursive structures of these sources, which is what I think ultimately Assad, and I would also say Ahmad, lead us to do, right?
I would also agree with you, Niels, that speaking is a material practice, but it's not the only material practice we should be interested in. So if we go back to this original dichotomy in Koselleck between a social history and a conceptual history, so if social structures are to be changed, if the material world is to be changed, then at some point you need bodies getting moving and not only people talking. So I can tell to the chair, or I can tell people move that chair as long as I want, and that's an important material practice that I'm telling that, but someone then has to bodily grasp that chair and move it, because otherwise things are not going to happen. So I'm a bit old-fashioned in that respect probably, but I still believe in a difference between speaking and the other forms of bodily engagement. So where does this topography come from, and is it a history or a topography? That is what I find so interesting in that case, that I would say that the first edition is a topography with a bit of history in it, and the second edition then becomes a history and with a bit organized around topography. And there are some instances, but not really many, of topographies of Delhi before that. So I would, that's why I was so fascinated by your article, to say that could offer a possibility of looking for blueprints, but then it comes to the whole thing about where does he get his language from? What are the blueprints? Where does the cultural language come from? And I've tried to trace that to some extent, but I think he's really annoying at times. So he quotes people and then he says, I read an English book, and what they say is, okay, what do you do of that? So if by some of these English books I could identify more or less by chance because I could recognize some of the references, if he then says, I read an Arab book, well, I don't think that's going to work. For Ibn Khaldun, I think the reception is a little bit later, but I still have to make that out. I'm waiting for David Lelfeld to write an article on that. He promised that he would do it, so perhaps not in time for that article. Not Ibn Khaldun, but I think Shah Waliullah has a whole theory on the change of historical times, which might come in there. I know that he is somehow in the Shah Waliullah tradition, and that he has read the book where he talks about it, but I haven't found any more direct references. So it seems to work in a slightly different way in his text than in Shah Waliullah's text. So I think it's one of the most annoying things, that it's really not possible to trace it more exactly where his references come from. And it would be something that a whole army of people in Aligarh hopefully will do one day, if I can convince them.
Thank you. Questions? So there is one in the back there. There's a mic.
Oh, do I need that? No, I don't need that, I think.
I think so.
What, really? It just, there was so much echo in the, oh, you need it for the thing. Okay. So this is the question for Margaret, and I'm trying to figure out what's going on in the last 2 pages of your paper, which I think something really interesting happens that has to do with sort of a re-emergence of an idea of the present. Where you sort of leave your conservative temporalities behind, and there's something else going on. Where the present re-emerges as, you say, a moment of decision, a moment of harsh and stark alternatives. It reminds us of Kozelek's and Carl Schmitt's definition of crisis, obviously. This is also the present of wasting time, which you say further down that looking at the watch and that present is something can be wasted. And it's also the present of emotionalization, which I think is extremely interesting and contradictory things to say. And then you end up saying, well, what is this? Well, it might be just another way of mobilizing every resource for a great task in the future. So you put it back into sort of an idea of future orientation. But it seems to be a very different form of time that emerges at this point in the material and also in your articles. I just wanted to, and it seemed to be hard to think that something can be a moment of stark alternatives, a moment of wasting time, and a moment for strong emotionalizations at the same time. I just wanted you to sort of think about that. What is that? What is going on here?
Yeah.
Is there any question? Okay, Vijay.
I was wondering, Margaret, with respect to the possible blueprints or prototypes, or at least preceding examples of topographies of Delhi, what relationship this text has to the Muraqqa-i Delhi by Dargah Quli Khan. And I was also wondering about, I mean, you sort of rushed by it, and partly that's, reflects the sort of phases of his life. The sort of standard historiography of Sir Sayid or Sayid Ahmad Khan, the big controversies over temporality were he was being attacked as a Nechari, as a Darwinian. Right? He's embraced the time revolution of the 19th century, and and so those, in fact, even it's been a long time since I've read David Lelyveld's book, but my recollection was that even after, the establishment of the college, that was one of the big issues for people sending their children to the college, was that he was a Nechari. He was he had abandoned, he was putting religion below the sort of scientific understandings of Europe and philosophical understandings. So and that was as I remember it, that was a very emotional time for, those were pretty harsh critiques that were being leveled at him. So I wonder if you could comment on that and how it percolates into the post-1870, because the college is founded in, 1875, I think? Thereabouts, 1876. So those were my thoughts about that.
We'll take one more.
So two things. First of all, I was wondering about the relationship or the non-relationship between the previous Shehrashub tradition and his topography, in the sense that both are, forms of writing about cities, what happens in cities, who lives in cities, and whatnot. I think that, there might be something important in that kind of difference from Shehrashub to the writing of a kind of new kind of topography. Also about Jadid, Tajdid, Mujaddid. I think, in the 15th or 16th centuries, if you said Mujaddid, obviously it means a renewer, but it also means a renewer of Islam in the sense that this person is going to restore Islam to its purity. So it is a renewer, the restorer in the late medieval, early modern sense, while in the 19th century, Tajdid, Jadid is something that's entirely new, in the sense of, fresh, new coming. Something new is happening, nothing is being restored, to the contrary. So again, I think, even in that change in the definition of Tajdid, Mujaddid, Jadid, there seems to be an interesting transition.
Okay.
Okay, the different presents, Helga, I'm not sure that I see them so much as differences. I think it is a point where the present becomes a moment of decision between either utter failure and the community is going to disappear, or success for the future. And it is the actions of the present generation and at this very moment which are going to decide between one way or the other way. And that, as far as I read it, is the reason for this intense emotionalization. And the waste of time comes in that this is not the moment where you can afford to waste even 1 minute, because you just have this very small window of opportunity. If you waste your time now, everything will be lost. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense, but it doesn't solve the other question when you say, well, this is maybe just another way of mobilizing resources for future projects in a more sort of continuously work to realize something in the future way, with that kind of crazy, chaotic crisis present.
Yeah, but you need to mobilize the resources, because it is not just continuing to have projects for the future, but at this very moment you decide about all of the future. So mobilizing your energy for either saving Aligarh or not is what is going to decide whether there will still be Muslims worth of that name in India or not. So it's not just, well, let's write the next proposal because continuously we need the money, and it does. I mean, of course, it changes a lot whether we get the proposal or not, but it is not something which is going to decide the future of academia. So it's more this: don't waste time now, because if your next proposal is going to be refused by your funding agency, there never again will be scholarship in Europe. So it's this kind of drama. Then the relation to the Muraka, I think on the one hand the Muraka does not have any history. It's sometime that I read it. It does not have any historical element in it. So it is not centered on topography. It is centered on people, or it's just that what I remember. So it is a young, for those of you who are not familiar with the text, it's the text of a young nobleman coming from Hyderabad to Delhi in the early 18th century, at a moment of invasion by Nadir Shah. So he accompanies his patron from the Deccan to Delhi. And you have this, I think he's about 21 or 22 at that time, and he comes to Delhi and he really enjoys the life in the city. He goes to the different courtesans, he goes to different concerts, and that is mainly what he is writing about. Or is that just my...
I thought you organized it around locations, and so there were stories. It reminded me of, I mean, it's for Sayid Ahmad Khan goes into much greater detail.
Yeah.
But there is this locational organizational principle.
Yeah, okay.
So the stories are connected to locations, not unlike
Yeah.
the first edition of
Yeah,
Sayid
okay.
Ahmad Khan.
Then it's...
So it has historical and genealogical, there's a Zargah here, and there's this, this stuff in South Delhi around the Minar and all that.
Okay, then I have to, then I have to reread it, because somehow I only remembered the scenes of the courtesans.
That's the most famous part.
Yeah. Then Sayid Ahmad Khan as an Ijri and the role of Darwinian time. That comes, I mean, his discussions on the role of science and of religion are earlier than Aligarh. So, but there it is not giving primacy to science, but it is mainly trying to reconcile the two, saying that the Word of God and the work of God can never disagree. So whatever is the work of God, that is nature, cannot be in contradiction to what is written in the Quran. And it is mainly trying to bring the two together and saying, if this is true, then science can never be a danger for Islam, because true science will not contradict true religion. That was seen slightly differently by his opponents. He doesn't really talk much about Darwin, I have the impression. So he takes up a Darwinian language at times, but he doesn't really. What would be interesting if he really takes up the temporalities which go with them. So if it is no longer a history which is limited to a couple of 1,000 years, but really a history of an evolution, I haven't come across that so much. So it is more mentioning it in passing, and then once Aligarh is founded, he also holds back on that, because he knows that if he is too vocal on these topics, then it will endanger the college, and nothing may ever endanger the college, because otherwise we lose the future. Then the Shehrashub. There again, I'm not, at least for the Urdu Shehrashubs that we have, I'm not sure how topographic they are. So it is very much about what kind of havoc does the beloved inflict to the city, and that is the occasion of talking about the city, but mainly of talking about the different social groups within the city. So you have descriptions of the city, but again of the people who are living in the city, more than about the buildings in the city. Yeah, so it's the professions. It gives a kind of a social history of a social panorama of the city, but not so the buildings are of less interest. But it would be interesting to, and it's very rarely concrete historical figures who come up in the Shehrashub. So it's more what does it do to the baker? What does it do to the perfume seller, and so on.
So we have a new notion of spatiality as well.
Yeah, I'm not sure I I'm qualified enough about the 17th and early 18th century to really see how far that is new. There are topographies at the time of Shah Jahan, but I haven't read them, and I'm not sure that my Persian will be sufficient for that blush. Okay. Then the question in how far Jadid is completely new at that time. I think the real temptation for, or the real reason why he is using Jadid and not modern is that Jadid allows, you can have several Jadids in the course of history. So you can have the Prophet as someone who was very Jadidi already. You can, at that time, it would be difficult to have multiple modernities. So saying the Prophet was modern would jar. So as far as I read it at the moment, it is that the main reason why he does not use modern transcribed into Urdu, or why he does not have a neologism which would lead him away from Jadid. So Jadid is both at the same time. It can function as a translation of modernity if he refers to the English context, but it is also something which was there already in the prophetic time.
So I have a question. Do you want to? Okay. I'm not a historian, but I'm an anthropologist, and I worked with Muslim population. So if we look at the Mahdiya movement, it's really started with the British allowing the Mahdi, giving him access to land to create, to start cash cropping of cotton. And that's how a lot of his followers came from the western part of the Sudan into the eastern part and established this very, very powerful movement. But it was complicit with the colonial powers, the British colonial power. If we look at the western part of Africa, we look at the role that Francophones also worked with the Murids, with also creating a new cash crop called peanuts. So I know there's nothing religious about peanuts or cotton, but the use of these crops to sort of entice population to wake up and come. So that if you were hesitant to be a member of the Murids, you suddenly did become, because you had a follower, but you also had opportunity to work. I was not sure how this really translated with the growth of Islam in northern Ghana, and which might be still an Anglophone country, but what are some of the roots that were established there to bring about such a vibrant sort of community, or for that matter, Nigeria? Whether your work also sort of touches or addresses some of these issues. Shahzad, you want to throw your question too?
Sure, I can throw it. It'll go slightly different directions, although maybe there's some points of correspondence. And actually, what I was going to do is to appoint myself Aishwary's agent to bring back his questions to the two of you. And I think one of the things that really struck me in Aishwary's response to the papers was to trying to push you both into a more universalizing theorizing with respect to history rather than the particularity, because the density of particulars is very much there. So in that way, I mean, I just posed one question, misinterpreting Aishwary to the two of you, to one each. So for Margaret, I think when Aishwary brought up the question of that this is universal, this is not just Urdu, the way I was reading it was not so much that whether that can be connected to Hindi or Bengali, but it can be connected to French and English and German. It's universal completely, right? So this is a universal theorization of time. In a way, we can make him talk to Kozelek or anyone else, or to Schiller, or right. So it seemed to me to be asking to go that level of abstraction. In the case of Shawn, I think the invitation towards the philosophy of history, you're using this the phrase, a very kind of evocative phrase of bundles that project holographic agency, and I realize that you're basing yourself on Schönberg and others, but I think the particular way in which you are using it and tying it to the particularity of the African situation, therein lies perhaps a way of thinking about feeding into a philosophy of history that deconstructs other ways of philosophizing history, while retaining why philosophy of history is so critical to understanding both phenomenology as well as temporality and so on and so forth.
Thank you. You want to answer these questions?
Sure. I mean, the two questions point in really different directions.
I know.
I mean, what I would say is, well, let me answer. I think I can actually answer them both in maybe half of a way. I mean, first I would say that some of the narratives that we have about these processes, again, I think economic historians of Africa now would push back pretty dramatically against some of these very state-centric narratives. So, you know, I can't speak to the Mahdi, but in terms of the Mouridiyya, you know, the role that the state actually plays is in some ways a negative one. That when the state decides that it will no longer enforce slave contracts, what begins to happen is that people leave slave plantations in masses, and an existing groundnut economy that had gone back to the 16th century, predating French control, benefits from the labor that's sort of freed up by the failure of the state. So, and then the state's quite happy to take advantage of the Mouridiyya in terms of the forms of indirect governance that they provide. But the idea that the French state, in a sense, facilitates, right, that initial movement, I think would be slightly overstated. And I guess what I would say is that what I would push back against would be the entire genre of questions about the growth of Islam in places or Islamization in places. And this would be my way of getting to your question, Shahzad, is that I think, and this is why I to Rian, that you know, in some ways our papers are very complementary, but I'm not sure if we're saying the same thing or the opposite thing, but which is that I think that it's precisely histories of connection, histories of spread, histories of affiliation, and histories of transformation into something called Islam that are the problem. And that in an African context, they can do nothing other than continue to reproduce these extremely pernicious forms of authority and extremely pernicious ways of imagining the relationship between orthodoxy and practice. And so that, you know, what this idea of the forms of agency that appear out of this concept of a bundle, which comes from a, you know, a kind of linkage of historical anthropology, historical linguistics and archaeology, is specifically about trying to narrate processes that have nothing to do with Islamization, growth of Islam, transformations within Islamic conceptual categories whatsoever.
I'm not sure yet how this conversation between Sayid Ahmad Khan and Koselleck would figure out, or whether I'm there already. I think what I could do at the moment is to use Sayid Ahmad Khan to de-universalize Koselleck, so to point out in how far some of his assumptions work very well to the kind of work he wants to do, but need substantial revision once we take them out of their anchorage. But I think that is not enough in the long run. So in the long run, we would need to take the results of work on people like Sayid Ahmad Khan in order to really rewrite Koselleck and produce something new. And I'm not there yet. I can tell you why Koselleck in certain respects doesn't work. So why, for instance, a concept like progress is completely different and has to be, not completely different, but substantially different, and has to be refigured. And we have to broaden our thinking about progress is not just this linear movement towards the future. Perhaps sometimes it's not towards the future, but upwards towards God, or it might be something completely different. But from there to arrive at something like what would a conceptual history, what would be the new assumptions for a conceptual history at a more global way. I'm working on that, but I haven't reached that stage yet. perhaps at the end of this conference, I'd be a step further.
Yeah. Aishwary, you want to say something?
No, I think the points have been clearly discussed. I just would like to say one thing. That's the notion of phenomenology that Shahzad brought up. I think the idea of speaking yields itself better, I think, or is rendered better into the phenomenology of religious experience as opposed to pure materiality. I think the way Shawn and you were speaking about it, I think, can be bridged if we understood this, the fact of religion. The fact is that religion exists in some form or the other, whether it's material or not, or spiritual or not, and so on. But the way it takes its form, its everyday form, I think that is where the power of movement lies in understanding the religious, and that is where phenomenology becomes extremely important. That said, I'm going to think more about why, if transformation is really not the stake here, or not the register here, and as I was also thinking, and I think this is very clear in both the papers, we also work with concepts at the very limits of their translatability.
Yeah.
Fact is that they are on the fringes of being translatable. Sometimes political thought can be a political thought of the untranslatables. And I think that I get. What I am left wondering with is where does, if colonial policy that changes after the mutiny, or policy, religious patronage and state policy in post-colonial Ghana changes after decolonization, as you two show remarkably well, there has to be some transformation at stake here, which is otherwise the word minority, which is so essential to your story, doesn't, I mean, why then use the word minority? Where does measures, where does statistics, where does social mathematics, where does the census actually become so powerful?
Yeah.
If that transformation of identity and moral psychology is not at stake.
Yeah.
That's the question I would like.
I think these are great notes to end this amazing panel. And you're absolutely right. When you bring in minorities, then you're opening the Pandora's box, because you're looking at other interpretation of Islam as it's practiced today in places like India and in other parts. Thank you so much, and thank you.
At what time would you